And that brings us to this idea of glucose and insulin levels increasing after eating on high-carb diets versus on low-carb diets, because the kind of assumption built in here, and I've heard this stated in many cases, that because you have an increase in glucose and an increase in insulin after eating on a high-carb diet, that's basically going to contribute to insulin resistance over time, and that's going to cause this state. And we'll talk about the fact that that doesn't happen, but it's also worth noting that there are considerable increases in insulin and glucose on low-carb diets as well, especially because of the protein that's consumed. And we'll look through a couple of studies talking about this. I mean, the first one is just looking at the insulinogenic effects of foods. And so this is a study titled An Insulin Index of Foods, the Insulin Demand Generated by 1,000 Kilojoule Portions of Common Foods. And it's an interesting study to look at because I think a lot of people would be surprised by what they see here. And the reality is that protein is something that largely stimulates insulin release. And what they found is that if you look at isocaloric amounts of fish and beef, it actually increased insulin more than really high carbohydrate foods like oats and pasta. There was a greater insulin release from the fish and beef. And you actually saw that when you compared it to high sugar foods like apples, again, isocalorically, fish and beef caused a greater insulin release, or about the same insulin release actually, as apples, or chips as well. Chips was another one that they looked at, and that was about the same as fish and beef. So this idea that you're only getting insulin excursions on a high-carb diet is very much not the case, considering that protein is a major stimulant of insulin production. And the same can be true on the glucose side as well. You can also see increases in glucose levels on ketogenic diets, even eating low-carb meals. And they show that here in this study, and this was a study that we looked at in the last episode as well. This one is titled Glucose and Lipid Homeostasis and Inflammation in Humans Following an Isocaloric Ketogenic Diet. It was a metabolic ward study on men without diabetes. They did 4 weeks on a normal diet, which wasn't a low-fat diet. It was 50% carbs, 35% fat. Sometimes they do far lower fat, which actually further increases insulin sensitivity, and you could even say that that's a bit of a confounding variable. But in this case, it was 35% fat versus a keto diet, which was 5% carbs and 80% fat. And we showed very clearly, we saw that there was, that the people on the ketogenic diet were in ketosis. They had the increased ketone levels, increased free fatty acids, increased glucagon, and they looked at the effects of eating a low-carb meal on glucose levels. And we see that here in figure 1, if we look on the left, this was a graph that we had looked at earlier, showing that on the carbohydrate-containing meal, there was actually significantly worse insulin sensitivity, and we saw increased glucose levels after that carbohydrate-containing meal. But when we look at the right here, this is looking at the people who are on the high-carb diet eating a ketogenic meal and the people on a ketogenic diet eating a ketogenic meal. And what they actually found was that the glucose area under the curve for the ketogenic diet participants eating the ketogenic meal was actually a little bit higher, not statistically significant, but it was actually a little bit higher than the people on the carbohydrate-containing diet eating the carbohydrate-containing meal. So what we're looking at here is on the left, you have the lower curve, the ones with the filled-in squares, versus on the right, you have the ones with the circles, the hollow circles. And what they actually found was that the glucose area under the curve was higher on the right for the ketogenic diet people eating the ketogenic meal versus the higher carb diet people eating the higher carb meal. So this idea that you're going to be dramatically increasing glucose all the time on your high carb diet, based on eating something with carbs, is not actually supported here. In this case, they're finding that eating the ketogenic diet meal led to the same amount of glucose increase as the high carb meal for the people on the high carb diet. So this idea that you're either getting a lot of insulin and glucose excursions after eating versus no insulin and glucose excursions after eating is really not at all accurate as to what's happening. So that's the first thing that's worth noting, is that if any insulin and glucose excursions cause insulin resistance, you would see that on low carb diets as well. But then the other thing that's worth touching on here is briefly touching on the evidence that high carb diets don't cause chronically high blood sugar. They don't cause chronically high insulin levels, and instead can and should, if done in a healthy way, they should lead to healthy and even very low levels of fasting insulin and low levels of glucose, low A1Cs, and good insulin sensitivity. And we can see this when we look at native cultures on high carb diets, and I'll link to these studies in the show notes so I don't weigh the episode down with too much of those. We can look at the Kitavans, who have a diet that's 69% carbs and 21% fat. They have very low fasting insulin levels. The average for men was 4, and for women it was 4.8. We We can look at this in the Tukey-Senta. This is a group that eats over 90% of their calories from carbohydrates, and they're incredibly insulin sensitive. They have very, very high glucose tolerance, no signs of metabolic syndrome. And there are other native cultures as well. I'll link to those in the show notes, but these are people who are eating high-carb diets for their whole lives, and they're not showing problems in terms of metabolic health or insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. And we can also see this looking in studies where they put people on high-carb diets, people who don't have insulin resistance, and see improvements in insulin sensitivity and weight loss, but then also in people who do have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, and see incredible improvements in terms of insulin resistance and weight loss, type 2 diabetes. And again, this flies directly in the face of this idea that consuming more carbs is just going to lead to insulin resistance, when the reality is it can reverse it. And so we'll start just touching briefly on the Kempner diet as an example. This is a very high carb diet, as much as 565 grams of carbohydrates a day, very low protein and very low fat. And they used this diet for people who were obese, for people with type 2 diabetes. They found that it decreased blood sugar levels, decreased insulin levels. People were able to lower their insulin dosing. In some of the studies, and one that we'll share here in a minute, 25% of people who were on this study were able to fully stop their insulin medication. And this was in a study titled Effect of Rice Diet on Diabetes Mellitus Associated with Vascular Disease. Now, in this study, I'll just kind of touch on a couple of the improvements that we're seeing. We won't go through it in detail, but they found that there's an average drop in fasting blood sugar by 47 milligrams per deciliter. The average decrease in weight was 7.3 kilograms or 16 pounds. 58% of the people in the study were able to decrease their insulin, and 25% were able to stop their insulin entirely. Again, this is people with type 2 diabetes. And they found that these improvements occurred both in patients who lost weight and in those who did not have a significant weight change. So it wasn't just driven by the weight loss. It was other, there's direct metabolic effects of this diet that led to massive improvements in insulin sensitivity. So that was the Kempner diet. Another notable one was the Pritikin diet. And this was a pretty similar diet. It involved a low fat, high carb, high fiber, and low salt diet. The Kempner diet was actually very low in fiber. But in this diet, they were getting less than 10% of calories from fat, around 15% from protein, and the rest from carbs. So we're talking about a very high carbohydrate diet here. They also made sure to incorporate walking as a part of the protocol. And they found that people lost weight. They were able to get off of their hypoglycemic drugs. They were able to stop insulin. And these effects happened rapidly within just a few weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. Large portions of people were able to get off of these drugs and lose weight. And then they did studies where they followed these people. They did follow-up studies for a couple years after, and showed that the benefits continued as long as they continued with the diet. So I'll link to these studies in the show notes. But again, some very clear high-carb diets showing incredible benefits for insulin resistance, as opposed to the opposite of this idea that they're causing insulin resistance. Now, there's also a number of very well-controlled studies showing the same benefits for high-carb diets on insulin sensitivity and reversing insulin resistance. So we'll touch on a couple of these. The first one is titled High Carbohydrate, High Fiber Diets for Insulin-Treated Men with Diabetes Mellitus. And in this study, they did 2 different diets. One was 43% carbs, 37% fat, and 20% protein. And then they compared that with 70% carbs, 9% fat, and 21% protein. So there's a big change, going to a much higher carbohydrate intake and much lower fat intake. They made sure that there was no weight loss in the study. So they made sure that, if someone was losing weight, they gave them more food so they didn't lose weight. And despite that, they still saw improvements in insulin resistance. People were still able to reduce their doses of insulin. They were still able to see lower blood sugar values. They were still able to stop their insulin medications altogether. So still massive improvements, totally independent of any changes in weight, as was suggested by the Kempner studies. We have this study here. I'm going to actually share this quote. This is one titled Changes in Body Weight, Body Composition, and Energy Intake in Women Fed High and Low Fat Diets. So they had women go from a higher fat diet of 37% to a lower fat diet of 20%. Obviously, high fat diet here is relative. We're not talking about a low carb ketogenic diet, but I'm just using this not to discuss that part as much as just the idea that you can see major improvements in metabolic health on a higher carb diet. And this is not something that's driving insulin resistance. And what they found in this study was that the women lost weight while increasing their calorie intake by nearly 20% relative to when they were on the high fat diet. And they state the effects of a 20% fat diet, low fat diet, on total body weight, lean body weight, and adiposity were studied in 18 premenopausal women with body mass index BMI of 18 to 44. Subjects were fed a 37% high-fat control diet for 4 weeks, followed by the low-fat diet for 20 weeks. Total body weight, lean body weight, and fat weight were measured at the end of the high-fat and low-fat dietary period. periods by hydrostatic weighing. Despite adjustments in energy intake to maintain weight throughout the study, subjects exhibited a 2.8% decrease in total body weight, an 11.3% decrease in fat weight, and a 2.2% increase in lean body weight by the end of the low-fat period. Similar changes were observed in obese and non-obese women. By the end of the low-fat period, energy intake had increased significantly in comparison with the high-fat diet to 119% of the high-fat intake. Results cannot be explained by changes in daily activity levels and suggest that macronutrient composition plays a role in energy requirements for weight maintenance. So what we saw here is a high-carb diet. The women lost body fat, gains lean mass in the process, despite eating 20% more or 19% more than when they were on the higher fat diet. Moving on to a couple others. This is a study titled Effect of High Glucose and High Sucrose Diets on Glucose Tolerance of Normal Men. So in this study, well, I'll read the quote and then we'll get to it. I'll explain it after. They state, as the dietary glucose content was increased progressively to 40, 60, and 80% of calories, a gradual improvement in glucose tolerance tests occurred. When normal subjects were changed from a control diet to one containing 80% of calories as sucrose, significant improvement in the oral glucose tolerance test occurred. These improvements in glucose tolerance tests were associated with slight reductions in plasma insulin levels. These studies demonstrate that short-term periods up to 10 weeks on a high sucrose diet led to improvement of the glucose tolerance in normal subjects. So I'm not suggesting that we should be getting 80% of our calories from table sugar. Obviously, that shouldn't have to be said, but obviously I'll throw that disclaimer out there. But what we're seeing here is that as the calories increase from carbohydrates, we didn't see worse insulin sensitivity and increase in insulin resistance. We didn't see, body fat gain or anything like that. What we saw was that increasing the calories up to as much as 80% from glucose or sucrose led to an improvement in insulin sensitivity. This was over 10 weeks. And then the last study here, improved glucose tolerance with high carbohydrate feeding in mild diabetes. And they found something similar. Again, this was in people with mild diabetes, though, not, in the last one, which was men without diabetes. And what they state was to evaluate the effect of increased dietary carbohydrate in diabetes mellitus, glucose and immunoreactive insulin levels were measured in normal persons and subjects with mild diabetes maintained on basal 45% carbs and high carbohydrate 85% carbohydrate diets. Fasting plasma glucose levels fell in all subjects, and oral glucose tolerance significantly improved after 10 days of high carbohydrate feeding. Fasting insulin levels were also lower on the high carbohydrate diet. However, insulin response to oral glucose did not significantly change. These data suggest that the high carbohydrate diet increases the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. So this was just 10 days. I think we would have seen even more improvements if it was gone on for longer, like in these other studies. But what we're finding is that the higher carb diets aren't causing high blood sugar. They're not causing higher insulin. They're not causing insulin resistance. Instead, they're actually causing the opposite. Now, again, I'm not saying that if we just took the average Western diet and said, eat, more carbs, drink more soda, that's going to be healthier for you. I'm obviously not saying that. I've made this disclaimer tons of times, but I'm not saying that all carbs are created equal or that the carbohydrates that most people in the Western world are eating are healthy foods. But that doesn't mean it's actually the carbohydrates that are the problem. There's a ton of other issues with those foods that are entirely independent of the carbohydrates. And what we see here in these studies and looking at the native cultures is that eating a high carb diet is actually supportive of metabolic health and insulin sensitivity. We just want to make sure that we're doing it from the right quote unquote sources of carbohydrates. Again, go ahead and download the Energy Balance Food Guide for free at jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to take a look at what I would consider to be the best sources of carbohydrates.